Hey everyone, Mr. Jeffersonian here, and if you haven't heard about Anchor, let me explain. It's the easiest way to make a podcast. First off, it's free, and who doesn't like that? There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer, and Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So the call to action is download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Howdy everyone, and thank you again for tuning in to the Jeffersonian Tradition. Before we get started, I have a couple of things to go over. For now, the podcast is mostly ad-free, and I sure would like to keep it that way. You can help me out with that by becoming a supporting listener. If you find value in the podcast, there's a link in the show notes page that will enable you to contribute to my work and to help keep the podcast going and keep it light on advertising. Contributions start as low as 99 cents per month, with two other brackets at $4.99 per month or $9.99 per month. If you're not comfortable with a recurring contribution model, I've also set up a Cash App profile for the show. One-time contributions can be sent through Cash App to the show's cash tag, which is $ Mr. Jeffersonian, and all of this information will be listed in the show notes page as well. Any contribution amounts help, and thank you in advance to anyone who chooses to pitch in. And if you like the show, then please be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for it. We are now available on all major podcast platforms. And to help the show grow, make sure to share it with your friends and family. In other show-related news, if there's a topic you'd like for me to cover, or if you just have general questions for me, I can be contacted at the show's email address, which is mrjeffersonian@outlook.com, or through the show's MeWe group, which is also titled The Jeffersonian Tradition. And if you're not on MeWe yet, then seriously, what are you waiting for? Unlike a certain other social media platform, MeWe respects the right to free speech and offers a privacy bill of rights. So if you'd like to be a member there, then download the MeWe app and search for me at the username Mr. Jeffersonian. The show group is private, so we must be contacts before I can send you the group invite. If you're not familiar with MeWe's platform, contacts are the same as being friends on Facebook. With all of that fun stuff out of the way, let's now turn our attention to the topic for today's episode. So today, we take our stand. And before we get started, I want y'all to know that I don't intend this episode to come off as hectoring or self-aggrandizing or anything like that. I'm genuinely afraid of what the next 6 to 12 months may bring if people don't find the traditional American spirit of resistance and stand up to the emerging tyranny of the Machiavellian elites. So why did I choose this title, I'll Take My Stand? Well, there's a compilation of essays that were written by the Southern agrarians of the same title. It's called I'll Take My Stand, The South and the Agrarian Tradition. And in this series of essays, they critique the encroachments that they perceived upon Southern culture. This compilation was published in 1930, and it had an acute level of relevance then, and it has even more so an acute level of relevance now in terms of cultural issues. Back in 1930, when it was first produced, they saw all the vestiges remaining of the Old South being swept away in a new industrial revolution that was being forced upon the South from the Yankee Leviathan in D.C., and from outside speculators that had flocked to the South in the post-war years, carpetbaggers, everything else. They were really starting to see all this stuff manifested roughly 70 years after the war had ended, or actually about 65 years after the war had ended. And they strove to find ways to combat this. One of the potent lines in there, one of the essayists says something to the effect of America was in danger of succumbing to what he feared most, which was progress for progress's sake or change for its own sake. and that nothing that we ever did could be progressive enough. Nothing we ever did could satisfy people who just sought change for the sake of change. And I think now, from a cultural standpoint, we're seeing that bear itself out in real time with all the progressive cancel culture and everything else that goes into that. So their answer was decentralization and regional government, and their hope was that by having regionalized government, it could preserve the aspects of society that they saw as worthy of preservation. So people being farmers, people being somewhat self-sustenant, and honor, gallantry, and chivalry of the members of society. And so it's a very poignant book. I would recommend anybody read it. You can get it on Amazon. When I bought it, it was relatively cheap. I think I paid about $20 for it. But again, it's called I'll Take My Stand, The South and the Agrarian Tradition, and it was written by the 12 Southern agrarians. Now, unfortunately, their vision was not to be, as the DC machine has grown infinitely over the past 90 years. But now, we have a chance to take our stand against this tyranny and cult of the so-called experts who have utterly destroyed people's lives and sanity over the past 18 months. And that starts with knowing our enemies. Who are they? Obviously, Anthony Fauci, the CDC, corporate oligarchs, Biden and Harris, county health commissioners, and state departments of health. And before we proceed from here, I want to be clear that I do hold a reciprocal liberty outlook on the issues that we're going to be discussing today. If people want to wear masks voluntarily, fine. If they want to get the jab voluntarily, fine. All I demand in return is that dissenters be given the same respect regarding our choices to not get the experimental vaccine or to not wear a mask. And it seems like that is completely beyond the scope of comprehension for so many people who have fallen for the hysteria that's been forced on us and propagandized on us for the past 18 months. So why do I consider the departments of health our enemy? They are medical experts, after all. And I say that loosely. And the main reason is that these departments are led by people who are not elected, and they are in no way accountable. This means you cannot simply vote them out. When their term is up, you can't vote them out because they don't have a term. They're not elected. Should state legislatures give weight to these people's input? In my opinion, not anymore. Not after what we've seen unfold. But to play devil's advocate, they should only give weight to their input whenever it has data to back it up. And that has not been the case throughout this entire pandemic. It's just not been the case at all. Everything that we've done was anti-science. It's not even that it was not scientific. It's that it was proactively anti-science. And it's just been horrible because we could see common sense told us when masks were first implemented, they were not doing anything to slow the spread. I live in Colorado Springs, and up here, mask compliance was through the roof, and yet we still raged on. The pandemic still raged on. It's like somebody said it. I forget who it was, so I apologize if you listen to this podcast for not giving you credit. But somebody said it several months ago that the virus is going to virus. No matter what you do, the virus is going to virus. And that is extremely true because, again, we had the mask mandates. Up here, we had pretty strict lockdowns that lasted for, I guess about 3 or 4 months. And then we reopened in phases. I assume a lot of other states did the same. But during the lockdown and at the height of mask compliance, the virus still raged up here. Still raged. Regardless of what we did, it still went on. And yet, the governor refused to give up his power. And that's a problem. So, as evidence of this, in terms of what I'm saying as far as masks not doing any good, Tom Woods actually put together an awesome test. It's at www.covidchartsquiz.com, and he obliterates the narrative that either mask or lockdowns worked. And I would implore the audience, please go to this website if you haven't already, take the quiz, and see how many answers you get right. And I think your mind will be blown there. Now, despite the overwhelming evidence that the cure was inarguably worse than the disease, state politicians in many states still chose to give near total deference to these power-crazed bureaucrats, and they effectively were letting them run the show. And again, these people are not elected. They have no real legal lawmaking authority, but state politicians deferred to them. And they clearly did not know how to handle power, and they wanted to see their ideal society forced on everyone, regardless of the economic harm that it did, the psychological harm, all that stuff. They let them run the show. And see, here is an unpleasant truth, but I have to restate that this is an indication of politics being downstream of culture. So what I mean by that is if people have any self-respect whatsoever, the politicians who enabled this will be gone when next their term expires, and rightfully so. And again, we have to ask ourselves, do we want freedom in this society? Do we want to be considered free, or do we really only care about not suffering any sort of physical harm whatsoever? And Brian McClanahan has talked about this in the past with the different types of liberty that's out there. You have liberty from and liberty to. And I want liberty to basically do whatever I want, as long as I'm not harming anybody else. And I know some people would counter, well, during a pandemic, you could you could accidentally harm somebody else because you could spread the virus, BS. But liberty from is liberty from fear, liberty from oppression, liberty from a virus. And that leads to a very dangerous method of governance, because you have politicians in some cases, unelected bureaucrats in some cases, who take it upon themselves to destroy people's lives in the name of fighting an unseen enemy, all in the name of giving you freedom from something or liberty from something. And so that's a very serious question that we need to ask. Now, there are some states in this union who have had that outlook pretty much since they came into existence, specifically up in the Northeast. That's been a pretty common theme for most of their history. But in the South and in the West, even in these regions that were historically very strong bastions of the liberty to mindset, you've seen a lot of will just leave these people, and they bow to whatever the state says, the state being either the general government or the local government. And while I am a fan of state government, they're not infallible, and at some point it is going to fall upon the citizens to resist this. Otherwise, it's never going to end. And I've said this the entire time about the pandemic. It does not end until people stand up and say, enough. We're not doing this anymore. Enough. So, again, very important questions to ask. What type of liberty do we want? Do we want liberty from or liberty to? So this may seem pretty bleak. So what is there to be optimistic about? Well, the only thing that gave us any observable control groups in 2020 was Jeffersonianism, so decentralization. South Dakota never locked down, and they never implemented a mask mandate. And guess what? Their outcomes were nowhere near as bad as states that did lock down and enforce masks. Some folks would argue this is because South Dakota is so sparsely populated, but their population density is actually quite high in their livable areas, which means that their citizens would have been coming into contact with each other just as frequently as many other states, and yet their outcomes were not noticeably different. Florida's Governor Rick DeSantis had the courage to listen to real epidemiologists such as Ivor Cummins, Jay Bhattacharya, and Martin Kulldorff when he made his decision to fully reopen Florida. And Florida's outcomes were comparable to California and New York, both states that maintain severe lockdowns and mask mandates. And that's something else, just the sheer level of gaslighting and all this, that New York would be held up as a model of what to do when Cuomo, in my opinion, is guilty of murder, because he was forcing, through the, I think it was gubernatorial executive order. If I'm wrong on that, somebody please correct me. But either as an act of the state legislature or as a gubernatorial executive order, nursing homes in New York had to accept people who had tested positive for the virus. And once it got in there, this virus has been a grim reaper for people past a certain age point. So you had horrendous amounts of death in New York early on, and it's just such a sick joke to me that they would be held up as the model of what to do. And Cuomo even wrote a book kind of detailing like, yes, this is the strategy that I pursued, and all hell me, I did such a wonderful job. I mean, seriously, what kind of sick joke is that? And then Texas Governor Greg Abbott, as bad as he may be on many different issues, also had the courage to reopen Texas around the same time as Florida reopened. Their outcomes have also been relatively in line with California and New York, states that had severe lockdowns and mask mandates. And Georgia, despite being accused of human sacrifice in an article from The Atlantic, and that's not an exaggeration, The Atlantic literally ran an article that said Georgia is about to experiment with human sacrifice back in April of 2020 when they reopened. They took the bold step of starting their reopening in April of 2020, and their results were also in line with states that chose to continue the lockdowns. So you see the trend here. It didn't make a difference. It did not make a difference. Any lives that may have been saved from the virus, unfortunately, were lost to other causes such as suicide, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, so on and so forth. So we really didn't accomplish anything. Think about that. People's lives were ruined, and we accomplished nothing over the past 18 months. So what I'm getting to here is that if it were not for the courage of these states, the general government was starting to look like it was going to try to impose a top-down approach when the Biden administration took office. So again, the states are the key here. That's what I preach in most of the episodes on this show. The states are the key. Now, there are a few extremely high-profile corporations and entities such as Google, Facebook, and the VA healthcare network that have announced they will require mandatory vaccines for their workforce. And actually, Biden just came out and said he's going to have an executive order that mandates all federal employees get the jab. So to this, I say libertarianism be damned. I am imploring states to interpose on behalf of their citizens and smack this down before it has a chance to get out of the cradle. Because on what grounds does any entity, public or private, have any right to force people to inject a foreign agent into their bodies without their consent? And this, I've discussed this with my wife. She doesn't quite see it the same way as I do, but this has really opened my eyes to people who claim to be pro-choice. If they go along with forced vaccination, they literally have no argument to stand on other than pro-choice to them actually means pro-murder. That's just the cold hard facts. There is no way for them to get around that argument. So for anybody out there who considers yourself pro-choice, think about this. Do people really have freedom of choice when it comes to what goes in their body or what does not go in their body? Now, that's what we can do at the state level. States can stand up and they can say, no, private company, whatever, federal agency, whatever. Honestly, I don't know, from a legal standpoint, I don't know how much authority they would have specifically over federal agencies other than maybe just nullifying the vaccine mandate within the state. But that's a separate argument. But for private companies, the states need to stand up and say, you will not mandate this. You will not terminate people for refusing to get this jab. And where I part with libertarians on this and why I say libertarianism be damned, undoubtedly there are going to be libertarians who say, well, they are a private company and, they pay your paycheck, they pay your bills. So if they tell you to do something, I guess you just better go on ahead, suck it up and do it. And again, that does not lead to outcomes that will produce a world that's worth living in my opinion. I don't want people to have that level of authority, public or private. I don't think anybody can be trusted with that. So what I'm wanting to see from a state level is the states come down on this hard, extremely hard, and say, you will not do this or we will shut you down within our state boundaries, or we're going to fine the hell out of you, whatever the sum may be. I know with Florida and Norwegian Cruise Lines, I think it was like $5,000 per individual that was asked to provide a vaccine passport. So states have the power to resist this, and they have a lot more power than just a group of unorganized individuals. That's another shortcoming of libertarianism on something like this. It takes power. I've said this in a couple of episodes. It takes power to check power. And the states are the best hope we have in resisting what could potentially be coming down the line. Now, on an individual level, and especially for individuals out there who are wavering, I also beseech you to stand up for yourself. If you think the vaccine will provide enough benefits to you to outweigh their side effects and the virus itself, then please, by all means, get the jab. However, if you're only considering it to appease a boss who doesn't really care about you anyway, or to appease an obtuse family member, then please take your stand. Within the last few days, Fauci has literally stated that with this new Delta variant, breakthrough cases are producing the exact same viral load in the vaccinated as it is in the unvaccinated. Let that soak in. This so-called vaccine doesn't keep you from getting sick or transmitting the virus. The only alleged benefits it provides, and this has been true from the entire time that it's been introduced, the only alleged benefits it provides are to mitigate symptoms and reduce chance of hospitalization. And folks, this is not what a free society looks like. And big pharma companies are already out banging their war drums for booster shots. And I actually was reading a report today. Pfizer is expecting over $33 billion in revenue from this vaccine and over $10 billion in profit. Just think about it. Of course they're going to be out trying to ramp up fear, trying to ramp up more and more people to get the jab. They want their kickbacks. And they have people in government, maybe at all levels, but we know at the general level, they have people in government who are more than happy to give them these kickbacks. The politicians get the control, the corporations get the money, everybody's happy. It's sick. Now, if one gives it any credence, the VAERS reporting system has reported that COVID-19 vaccine-related deaths are well over 11,000 at the time of this recording. That's more than all other vaccines combined since 1990. And there's some evidence that would say that maybe it's being severely underreported. I've actually seen some estimates as high as 45,000. But the official number on VAERS as of today was roughly 11,400. So just keep that in mind. This thing is not risk-free. Now, granted, that's a small number compared to the overall number of people who have gotten it. But if you're not sick, if you're young, if you're healthy, or if you've already had it and you have antibodies, there's no reason for you to get this, in my opinion. But again, I will not bully you if you choose to do so as long as it's done voluntarily and you know the risk benefits. So the response to that may be, but I have to pay my bills. Well, yes, you do. We all do. All I can say for that is start doing everything you can to be at least moderately financially independent. So that could be investing in stocks, specifically dividend stocks. That can be maybe trying to have some sort of rental property. That could be any number of things. But start now planning to at some point make yourself financially independent. Because we cannot keep losing these battles to the corporate elite. However, while you are still stuck with a company, then please have the courage to speak up. It's my opinion that almost every private company of any notable size has essentially become a pyramid scheme, but many places do offer town hall environments periodically where company brass will show face to the peons at the bottom of the pyramid. So at the place that I most recently worked, we probably... I guess maybe about once a quarter, we would have a town hall. And sometimes we would get the CEO. Honestly, not very often will we get somebody who was that high up. But at the very least, we would normally get like vice presidents, assistant vice president, so on and so forth. So we would get people who were in like that next to the top level of management, if not the top of the pyramid itself. But every once in a while, maybe like once a year, the CEO would actually show up himself. So have the courage to speak up. If your company does that, have the courage to speak up. And especially if you're in middle management, your courage could inspire a wildfire in the rank and file. Now, at my former employer, I asked the CEO directly why he had made a certain decision regarding policy within the company. Obviously, he did not appreciate that, and he deflected the question. But the bigger objective that I wanted to achieve was to cause a stir with my coworkers, which my question successfully did. So my coworkers took away and said, "Oh yeah, no, why, we haven't thought about it like this. Like, yes, what about this?" And so that was a good thing. Now, ultimately, the policy in question was not implemented. Full disclosure, I don't think it was because of my question. I think it was because the company had honestly gotten to a point it really couldn't get out of its own way to accomplish anything. So I think it's just more from managerial ineffectiveness than my question. But the bigger point was to make people think. And so the point here is we must risk being unpopular if we have any hope of resisting the ugly future that seems to be awaiting us, especially if we believe that life is more than mere existence and the consumption of oxygen. And to me, life is much, much more than that. Concerts, I'm not really a concert goer, but I know a lot of people are, but concerts, being able to go to rodeos or any other type of sporting event and just be yourself and have fun with friends, so on and so forth, that is life. Life is not sitting in a room surrounded by four walls, breathing, waiting around to die. And I do want to tell another story about myself. Again, I'm not doing this to self-aggrandize. I'm just doing this story or telling this story more so to show you I'm not invulnerable to all the social pressures around this. So when our governor, Jared Polis, here in Colorado, implemented his mask mandate, I went along with it for about 6 months. And I did this primarily because my wife is the living embodiment of non-confrontation. And I didn't want to cause her any undue stress. However, I came to absolutely abhor masks as a symbol of compliance and the elite's sick way of lording their authority over the masses. And as such, as of January 1st, I made it my New Year's resolution to stop wearing masks regardless of my wife's anger when we would go out. And I'm happy to say that's honestly the one New Year's resolution I've ever been able to keep. I fall into the trap every year of making a resolution to do this or not do that, and normally I end up lapsing back into those bad habits. But this one, I was able to keep it. And there were many times in places like Walmart or sporting goods stores or really any type of store where I was literally the only person in the store not wearing a mask. And at times that was super uncomfortable because I would get a lot of stares, and quite a few times employees would try to hassle me and get me to put on a mask, and I would not give in. I dug my heels in and I would not give in. And eventually, this was sort of inspiring. Eventually, I had a couple of times, one time in particular, I was at Lowe's, and I walked in there without a mask, and I went towards the back of the store. I was actually getting some MDF, like small 1x6 boards to redo some of our trim work around our floor. So at our Lowe's, that's in the back of the store. So I went to the back of the store, didn't have my mask on, and there were two older guys back there, and they did have masks on until they looked up and saw me. Once they saw me, they actually took the mask off, shoved them in their pocket, and then one of them kind of just grinned at me, and that was awesome. That was a great feeling. So sometimes all it takes is one person to inspire multiple people. And if you have a chance to be that person, then please do it. We are standing on the brink of despotism like none of us have ever seen, and temporary discomfort is a very small price to pay in the name of resistance. And wrapping it up for today, the main takeaway, as the lyrics to this show's intro song proclaim, is resistance to the tyrants never yield. Shout, shout the battle cry of freedom. We should not be afraid to stand up to corrupted and incompetent authorities. And never forget that 2 weeks to flatten the curve has morphed into 18 months of insanity with threats of mandatory vaccination or vaccine apartheid and vaccine passports to resume truly normal pre-pandemic life. Never forget that. Please remember, if you found value in the podcast, to consider contributing to the show. You can contribute on a recurring basis through the supporting listener link in the show notes page, or you can make a one-time contribution by using the show's Cash App information, which is also included in that show notes page. Any contribution amount helps, and thank you again to everyone in advance who decides to do so. Also, please consider downloading the MeWe app and joining the show's private group so we can have more sane discussion around historical and current political issues. And all right, with another episode in the books, thank you again for tuning in, and I'll talk to y'all next time.